Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be looking at Game 18 from the 1972 World Chess Championship between Bobby Fischer and Buddy Spassky. Bobby Fischer coming into this round has a 3-point advantage over his opponents, and it seems like he's been content with draws over the past few games. He's had some winning positions, he's converted those into draws, and he seems okay with that. So coming into game 18, it'll be interesting to see his approach with the white pieces. Very quickly, he could be putting a nail in the coffin if he gets a few wins here. But Spassky playing the black pieces will look to try to get something going. He hasn't won a game in quite some time now in this series. But we'll go ahead and get started. Bobby Fischer plays pawn to e4, his favorite opening in chess. Pawn to c5, so the Sicilian defense. Knight to f3. Pawn d6, knight c3, knight c6, so getting into the classical variation. Pawn d4, pawn captures, knight d4, and then knight to f6. There's a few ways that Bobby Fischer can play this. Bishop here to g5, or if you wanted to, bishop to c4. We've talked about before, many times when your opponent plays pawn to d6, you can bring your bishop out here to c4, attack these light squares. They still may play pawn to e6 or e5. Sometimes you even wait for them to play pawn to e5 so that there is no protection on these light squares. Bobby Fischer decides to go ahead and play bishop here to g5, getting your dart squared outside of the pawn chain, pinning down this knight if this pawn ever moves. And we see Buddy Spassky play pawn to e6. He wants to open up for the queen to protect this knight here on f6. It's always awkward if nothing's protecting it and the bishop takes and you have to take away from the center of the board, or even worse would be to take with your pawn right here. Just loses protection for your king. And now if you look at it and say, well, why isn't it better just for the white to or this pawn to come down here to e5. This not only opens up the door for the queen to defend this knight, but it also attacks the knight. Well, it just gets awkward after the bishop takes, and then if the queen were to take back here, because we already talked about how awkward it is if you take with this pawn, then the knight coming up to d5 is a strong attack that black just doesn't want to have to deal with. Attacking the queen, also threatening the knight up here to c7. Yes, this knight is under attack, but anytime white wants to, he can just exchange up here on c6. So not a variation that black wants to go down. If you are playing this as white in the classical variation and you see this, just be aware of some of the options that you have from white's perspective. So we see bishop up here to g5, and then just pawn to e6. Queen here to d2, just signaling that, hey, I can castle on the queen side, or can still get this light square bishop involved into the game and castle on the king side as well. Pawn to a6, this is more of a move we see a lot in the Sicilian defense, similar, one of the variations, the Najdorf defense that starts out very early, but this stops both the knights coming up here to b5. It also starts for a preparation for attack on the queen side, knowing that Bobby Fischer may be castling on the queen side. This does set up for a potential attack from black on the queen side. Castle on the queen side, bishop to d7, getting that involved into the game, and then pawn up here to f4. So usually what's going to happen is once you castle on one side of the board, you start to just throw everything in the kitchen sink at your opponent on the other side of the board. You don't have to worry too much. Usually you're not going to be playing your pawns very forward in the game because you don't want a lot of air in front of your own king, but since there is no king on the king side, then a lot of pawns pushing up here. So pawn to f4, this is an also outpost for the bishop here on g5. Bishop to e7. And then knight comes back here to f3. And this is a nice move. If you look at the setup and see this bishop on e7, it was back here on f8 just protecting this pawn. Now it comes to e7. It's protecting both the pawn and the knight here on f6. But okay, this bishop is doing double duty. And anytime a piece from your opponent is playing double duty, you need to start to attack that particular piece or one of the pieces it's protecting. And that's exactly what Bobby Fischer does. He plays knight back here to f3. Now the queen is attacking this pawn and the bishop is attacking this knight. This bishop's playing double duty. So, you know, if this bishop were to take right here, then black's going to have a hard time trying to defend this square. He could always retake with this pawn right here. So he could play a move, which I think would be the optimal move for Buddy Spassky. And this queen to c7. It relieves some of the pressure from this bishop on e7 to doesn't have to defend both of these squares. But instead he plays pawn down here to b5, which makes sense just from a thematic standpoint of what black wants to do. But in this position, it's not as good because now bishop takes on f6. The bishop can't take here on f6. We already talked about it. It's bad because it loses material here on d6, which is what Bobby Fischer was going for. And so black is forced to take with his pawn here on f6. Probably not going to be castling on the king side. Bobby Fischer has a setup to attack here on the king side, and last thing you want to do is castle where you don't have a lot of protection. So this king looks to be staying in the center of the board for the rest of the game. Bobby Fischer continues with bishop up here to d3, then queen down to a5, attacking this pawn here on a2. And this is another nice little thing that Brady Spassky's trying to do, which Bobby Fischer is very aware of this. But as you're looking in your own game, you can see that this pawn right here can easily come to b4 and attack this knight. This knight's forced to move. And so what piece or square is this knight defending? It's defending the square here on a2. So Brady Spassky comes down to a5, and a lot of players would look at this and say, okay, my pawn here on a2 is protected. I don't have to worry about it. But if white's not too careful, then just pawn to b4, forcing the knight to move, and then the pawn is going to fall. So Bobby Fischer plays king to b1 to make sure he can protect this pawn here on a2. Because the next move, and that's exactly what Brady Spassky does, plays pawn to b4, forcing the knight to come back here to e2. Queen to c5, just centralizing, trying to have an attacking position from Spassky. Pawn up here to f5, pawn down to a5, knight to f4, pawn down to a4, so just pushing on the queen side of the board. Rook over here to c1, rook to b8, so both sides just maneuvering a little bit. Pawn to c3, pawn down here to b3. And this is an interesting position where Brady Spassky has an option to start blowing up some of the pawns here on the queen side of the board. Instead, he opts for a different approach. Pawn to b3. Bobby Fischer, I would imagine, played this pretty quickly, but pawn to a3, and this actually solidifies the pawn chain in front of the white king, making it pretty safe for Bobby Fischer. So interesting to see how Brady Spassky did not want to exchange some of the material here on the queen side, potentially had a stronger attack later in the game, but instead decided for blockading those pawns right here. Knight to e5, and this is a position where Bobby Fischer has to make sure he plays pretty carefully here. Both of his knights are in the center of the board, so Bobby Fischer has good control of the center. If he were to take right here, this would be a mistake. We could see the knight take here on e5. The pawn takes here on e5. Now all of a sudden, this has opened up this d file for the rook to get involved and really control this, where before Bobby Fischer can control with the semi-open file since he doesn't have any pawns blocking his rooks. He can come over here to d1. This also forces the knight to move. So knight over here to h5. Probably doesn't want to come back here to e2. Can't come here to g2. So h5, it's just sort of awkward. And now all of a sudden in a couple moves, black has completely controlled the center of the board. So while it may look like, fair trade, I'll just go ahead and exchange these knights off the board, definitely something Bobby Fischer is not looking to do. Instead, he plays rook to f1. Now knight over here to c4, attacking the queen. Bishop takes, exchanging. Queen takes here on a c4, and then rook to e1. So Brady Spassky does have the bishop pair, which is good, but it tends to fare better in open games. And by that, I mean not a lot of material in the center of the board, especially pawns, blocking off the squares where it can go to. Knights tend to fare better in these type of games. So all in all, Bobby Fischer definitely has the upper hand right now in this position. Brady Spassky moves king to d8. I think he had another option of rook here to g8. You want to get your rooks involved to open files where they can really attack. This is a semi-open file where the rook's going to be putting a lot of pressure on this g2 square. You always want to come down to your opponent's second rank if you're the black pieces. Not something he can take right now because both the knight and the queen are defending it, but just another thing that Bobby Fischer has to think about as he's trying to formulate a game plan. But we see black play king to d8, king back here to a1, rook down to b5, so trying to be aggressive and get more pieces involved into the game. Knight to d4, a rook over here to a5, knight down here to d3, King c7, so it looks like Spassky is actually looking to get all his material over to the queen side of the board with king to c7, bringing his rook over here, really start to see if he can chip away. It is going to be difficult because of the blockade from the pawns. I think this may have worked if he traded off earlier. He can just overwhelm his opponent with material. But knight here to b4, pawn down to h5. Pawn g3, rook to e5, and then knight back here to d3, attacking this rook. Now, I was expecting for the rook to just come back, maybe have a repetition here, and then Spassky chooses to do something else. Instead, we see rook to b8. Just saying, hey, if you want to take this rook here on e5, go ahead and do that. Bobby Fischer got a little tricky, and instead of just taking it, played queen to e2, looking for a knight moves, and then it's also attacking the queen here on c4. I don't think he needed to be that tricky. He has the option of just taking here on e5 if he wants to. That's going to be completely fine. I think he probably should have done that. But in the game, played queen to e2, rook back here to a5, pawn takes on e6, pawn recaptures, rook here to f2, and then pawn down here to e5, forcing the knight to move. Knight comes up here to f5. We do see an exchange. The rook comes to f5. This is going to be a tricky square for black to ever remove this rook from. Not only is it an outpost, you can always remove an outpost by attacking the pawn here on e4, but because black doesn't have a light square bishop, also doesn't have a knight to kick this off, this is going to be a pain in black's side for as long as Bobby Fischer wants it to be. Now we see pawn down to d5. The pawn takes, and then the queen recaptures here on d5. And this is a position where I think Spassky overlooked a huge attack that Bobby Fischer has, and that's pawn to c4. Now, Bobby Fischer did not play that. In the game, he played knight to b4, opening up the door for the queen to attack these light squares, attacking the queen right here. But pawn to c4 makes a lot of sense. The reason is the queen can't take here on c4, just rook to c1. It's protected by the knight, and this is pinning down the queen. The queen is going to fall in this position, so definitely not a good thing for black here. And you know, if for some reason the queen comes back, let's say queen to c6, then the rook takes here on h5, and then depending on where black goes, just the rook's going to come up to the 7th rank. You always want to be on your opponent's 7th rank. Get behind enemy line, start to attack. This pins down the bishop. So we can see Spassky play a rook to d7, but now black's in defense mode. White is behind enemy lines. He can start to maneuver his other pieces. I think this is a really good position from white. But in the game, decided not to play pawn up here to c4, instead plays knight to b4. So queen comes back to d7, rook takes on h5, bishop takes and says, let's go ahead and exchange. So white is up in material, but he does have, you know, these 3 pawns over here. It's going to be tough to materialize any of those. As this pawn pushes forward, he's going to be by himself. So all in all, both sides are fairly equal in the game. Rook over here to d5, rook to c1 check. King to b7, a pretty safe king here on b7. Queen to e4, pinning down this rook. Rook to c8, rook to b1. And now Bobby Fischer, as we've seen in the past, seems to have gone into a I just need a draw mindset. This rook on b1 is just playing completely defensive now. It's not evolved into the attack. When your opponent has a queen and 2 rooks, it's going to be very difficult to do much with just a queen and a rook in the attack mode. So Bobby Fischer knows it's going to be tough for his opponent to ever attack him since his king is so safe, but seems to have resigned the fact of going for a win himself. So king to b6, rook to h7. Is protected by the queen here. So just attacking. Both sides are going to just go back and forth, maneuvering around the board, seeing if either side is going to make a mistake. But very easy for both sides to defend all of their pieces, their pawns on the board, because they do have all of their major pieces in the game. And so eventually they have a 3-fold repetition, and after 47 moves, they have a draw. So Bobby Fischer, I kind of feel like it's a congratulations because this is exactly what he wanted to happen. He holds a 3-point advantage. It's going to be very difficult for him to lose 3 points in this series just because he's completely dominating his opponent, but Spassky hasn't won in many games. So exciting game, always fun to see different variations in the Sicilian defense. We don't see the classical variation all that often anymore. I feel like the Knight Dwarf, even some of the dragon variations, see more of the high level play. So the classical, always nice to analyze it and see different positions and how you can apply that to your own games. So hopefully you guys enjoyed watching Game 18 from the 1972 World Chess Championship. Until next time, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in Game 19.